Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name's Alan. In Star Wars, war is a constant presence no matter who is in charge of the galaxy. The Clone Wars during the Old Republic era was perhaps one of the most devastating wars in the galaxy. For 1,000 years prior to the Clone Wars, the Republic had been completely demilitarized and at relative peace. The prosperity and stability during this era left many worlds and many citizens of the Republic completely unprepared for the horror to come. But the reality is no matter where a war takes place, no matter what period of time it is or technological level the combatants possess, the reasons why we go to war never really change, neither do the tactics and strategies. Which is why I want to start a series today that will look at important battles in Star Wars history and talk about their real-life historical equivalents. Something that a lot of you guys already do in the comment section. Now, these comparisons are never really going to be perfect, but we'll try our best. Today, we'll be starting off the series by looking at the Battle of Geonosis, the first encounter that kicked off the Clone Wars, and we'll be comparing it to the First Battle of Kharkov during World War II. The year is 1941 and the month is October, and the German army was marching towards Moscow in the midst of Operation Barbarossa. 2 years earlier, the Nazis and Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty with each other and secretly divided the nations in between them amongst each other, including Poland, Lithuania, Finland, and many other Eastern European nations. Known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this was a disastrous political alliance for the Allied powers. The British and French had just months before failed to secure support from Stalin to guarantee the independence of Romania and Poland. Stalin had wanted a guarantee of a full military alliance with the Western European powers, but the Nazis and Soviets were deemed to be too incompatible by the British and the French negotiators, and there was no urgency for such an alliance. They clearly failed to understand that fascism and communism are actually quite similar, despite what most people think. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi forces invaded Poland from the west, executing thousands of Polish civilians, including many Jews. This violated the Munich Agreement signed just a year before by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. The agreement was the result of the Nazis' hostile annexation of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain was well-meaning but also extremely naive and could be compared to Chancellor Valorum in some ways. Chamberlain wanted Hitler to promise not to take over any more territory. In exchange, the British and the French would not retaliate over Germany's hostile takeover of Czechoslovakia. Of course, Hitler had no intention to follow the Munich Agreement in the first place, and Poland was hardly prepared for war against the might of the German military machine, which at the time was second only to the French military. 2 weeks later, with the Polish armed forces completely occupied on the Western Front, the Soviets crossed the border and swept through eastern Poland without much resistance, breaking their own Soviet-Polish Non-Aggression Act from 1932. In the next 2 years, everything went according to plan for the Germans. The Soviets got bogged down in a costly and embarrassing war against Finland. The Germans stunned the world by quickly destroying the combined French and British military forces in France with an unexpected assault through the Ardennes forest. And the Nazis and the Soviets signed another trade agreement. The Soviets would send raw materials to Germany, and in return, they would get war material from the Nazis. But as similar as their goals and tactics were, the Nazis and Soviets were natural enemies. And Hitler, being a lunatic, started drawing up plans for invading the Soviet Union. He planned on removing all the Slavic people from Russia and then replacing them with Germans. And so, with Western Europe on its knees but not completely defeated, Hitler foolishly starts a second front in Europe against the advice of his military advisors. Operation Barbarossa was launched on June 22, 1941. The superior mechanized forces of the German military plowed right through Eastern Europe, destroying entire Soviet divisions. Despite the Soviet Union's massive size, massive population, and large amount of resources, their military suffered from a lot of political liabilities. Stalin, who was just as crazy as Hitler and perhaps a bit more paranoid, had carried out several purges, which led to the majority of his military high command being executed. Also, Soviet forces were caught completely off guard and demobilized when the Nazis attacked. Contrary to popular belief, the Soviet armed forces were usually as well equipped as their German counterparts, but suffered from a lack of good leadership in the earlier years of the war, along with constant oversight from commissars or communist political officers in charge of party loyalty. This is also one of the reasons why the Soviets performed so poorly during the Winter War against Finland. Despite only having a population of 3.9 million against the Soviet Union's 200 million, the Finnish were able to inflict huge and embarrassing losses against the Soviet forces and destroyed the legitimacy of the Soviet military, which most likely also inspired Hitler to invade the Soviet Union. In some ways, the Winter War foreshadowed the poor performance of Soviet soldiers the same way that the Battle of Naboo foreshadowed the poor performance of separatist forces during the Battle of Geonosis. At the Battle of Naboo, numerically superior and better equipped Trade Federation droids were defeated by a much smaller and poorly equipped Naboo force. The same problems that plagued the Trade Federation army, including lack of good leadership and strategy, would again be a problem during the Clone Wars. Now, on the southern flank of the German offensive towards Moscow, German forces reached the city of Kharkov by October 20th. While the Germans mainly saw this battle as an effort to protect the right flank of Operation Barbarossa, for the Soviet Union, Kharkov was a major transit hub and strategically very important for the entire region. It was also one of the largest industrial centers of the Soviet Union. The Kharkov tractor factory was where the famous Soviet T-34 tank was developed and designed. Kharkov's numerous factories were also responsible for constructing aircraft, artillery, mortars, small arms, munitions, and other military equipment, making it very crucial to the Soviet war effort. Now, Geonosis actually served a very similar purpose for the Confederacy of Independent Systems. The droid foundries on the planet supplied a huge amount of war material for the separatist forces. The Stalgas and Hive ran massive foundries underground for Baktoid Armor Workshop, where the separatist super tank was designed and developed. Geonosis was also responsible for constructing droid starfighters, a variety of different battle droids, including the B-1 and B-2, along with battle rifles. The Grand Army of the Republic at the time was relatively new, and unlike the German forces at Kharkov, the Clone Army was vastly outnumbered by the separatist forces. But both the Clone Army and the Nazi forces were highly motivated soldiers that were well equipped and well trained for an offensive. They also were heavily mechanized and supported by armor and artillery. On the separatist side, a large mass of cheaply manufactured battle droids were deployed along with some armor and artillery. The 216th Rifle Division had just recently been reformed after the disastrous defeat they suffered during the Battle of Kiev. Like the separatist droids sent by the CIS High Command, the 216th served little more than a speed bump for the incoming offensive. The 216th's main purpose was to hold off the German advance and allow the rest of the 38th Army to strategically retreat and, more importantly, hold on to Kharkov long enough for all the factories to be disassembled and brought behind the new Soviet line of defense farther to the east. The German High Command and Officer Corps were in high spirits after driving thousands of miles through the heart of Russia with very little resistance. They underestimated their Russian enemies, partly due to their experience and partly due to their racist views of Eastern Europeans. But despite the success of Operation Barbarossa, the operation was still dragging on much longer than originally planned. The operation was supposed to end during summer. The German forces were ill-equipped for the Soviet winter and the challenges that lay ahead. In a similar way, the Jedi officers commanding the Clone Army during the Battle of Geonosis completely underestimated the separatist droid army, which ultimately led to very basic and ill-advised human wave tactics against the separatist positions. The western outskirts of Kharkov were very similar to your average Eastern Front battlefield, which meant large open plains and rolling hills, usually covered in grass or, in this case, mud. The Russian defenders, like the separatist forces, lacked any significant air support, which would have been very effective in this type of terrain where cover was limited. As a matter of fact, the 216th Division received almost no support from the 38th Army, which it was covering. Ultimately, the German forces were able to take Kharkov relatively quickly, but not before over 70 major factories and their equipment were evacuated on almost 320 trains. This German victory was a major strategic loss. Operations like the ones carried out by the Soviets at Kharkov allowed the USSR to survive and continue fighting. The Battle of Geonosis was also a similarly disappointing victory for the Republic military. Alongside the incredibly high casualties Republic forces suffered, the majority of separatist droids assembled by the factories on Geonosis were allowed to escape and fight another day. This would significantly prolong the war for the Republic. Due to its location and strategic importance, Kharkov would be the site of as many 4 major battles and switch hands between the Nazis and Soviets several times. The planet of Geonosis would also suffer a similar fate during the Clone Wars and be a constant battleground for both separatist-backed Geonosian forces and the Clone Army. As you can see in both of these battles, whether it's the Republic or the Nazis, the attacking force failed to grasp the more important strategic goals in these kind of battles, which was not just defeating your enemy, but preventing them from escaping with very important war material. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes in this series, and as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.